Pues me identifico como latina.
Me considero que soy un latino viviendo en los Estados Unidos.
I identify as Mexican because that's how I grew up identifying in my household, and I also grew up around a lot of Mexican, people who identified as Mexican also, so that's just kind of like what I was surrounded by, so I picked that identity. And I only recently started identifying as Latina when I came to college, because I became more educated on like the variety of just like Latin America as a whole, so I think it's more inclusive, so that's why
I actually consider myself more American because my dad, he came here when he was 18. He came from Mexico, but he came here when he was 18. So the whole trying to like fit in and everything, he made himself more Americanized. And my mom also, she's from Nicaragua, but her coming at such a young age, she tried to fit in. She wanted to like be with, like not be an outsider. So them trying to like Americanize made us more American. Like my mom has no type of Nicaraguense culture into like the family, and my dad, he never brought no Mexican culture into us, like nothing. Like we're just so Americanized. We may eat Mexican food or anything like that. We may look Mexican, but we're so Americanized for the reason that my parents try to like fit into the American society.
How do you feel about that?
I kind of feels weird because like I want to be like, oh, what, like the Mexican side of me, you know, like I'm Mexican and stuff and Nicaraguense, but I have no idea what that lifestyle is like because my parents try to like fit in so much. So I'm just a plain American. Like I may look Mexican and be like, oh, you're Mexican or Nicaraguense and stuff, but I'm just American. That's
I consider myself a Hispanic Latino mainly because I speak Spanish and I was born and raised for the first 7 years of my life in Mexico, Oaxaca, essentially being born in a Latin American country. So that's why, and I guess a big aspect of being a Latino for me is like having those roots that I learned through my mother and the things that she would teach us, the customs, you know, like whether it be something as, say, eating tortillas and frijoles or like speaking the language is a big thing, you know, or like the idea of family, the unity that I would consider a lot of Latinos or Hispanics have with their families. Those are big things for me, big values, you know. Even, I guess, religion, why not, but like that's why I would say I am a Latino and Hispanic, broadly speaking.
I consider myself a Latina. I identify as Latina because I don't feel comfortable with being called Hispanic, because that goes into how the Spaniards came and brutally murdered my ancestors. So I consider myself more.
I think generally I answer Latina now when I'm asked about my identity, but it was a term that I had to come to terms with, or I guess like arrive at, if that makes sense. Generally, like growing up, I always just said Mexican American or Hispanic interchangeably. But now that I've learned more about what it means to be Latina in the United States, and like that position of power as a Latina, I think I embrace the term a lot more. Being a hyphenated American, so Mexican American, didn't really define me truly. So when people say Mexican American, it's almost as if there's this idea of what Mexican means and then what American means, and it's two very different things, like struggling to be joined together. But Latina, for me at least, kind of coalesces those identities and relates to how I see myself as one whole being rather than two different beings struggling to coexist, if that makes sense. And also, I think particularly for me, it's very important to say that I'm Latina because I guess it's historical significance, at least for me, the fact that we have to come up, at least I feel like we have to have a way to distinguish ourselves from perhaps others in our unique experience. So what the experience of a Latina versus the experience of X, Y, and Z is very different. And having that term for me allows me to constantly like relate to others that are also identifying the same way and helps them, I guess, identify me. And I think like when I walk into a classroom and I say I'm Latina, and other people who also label themselves Latino, are able to see, hey, she has pride in her identity, and we can connect with her, we can understand her story. And it might not always be the same, but I think it allows for us to start making those connections.
I consider myself all three, Latina, Hispanic, and American, because, well, I came to the United States and I became a citizen. I'm Mexican, by the way, I feel like all three categories, Hispanic, Latina, and American, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. What I mean is that if you're in one category, it doesn't mean you can't be in another. So.
I consider myself Latino because I'm half Salvadorian and half Mexican, so I can't really be considered Hispanic. But at the same time, I could consider myself American because I was born here in America. And, well, to be honest, anybody that's born in North, Central, or South America is considered American because it's all American.
¿Y cómo mantiene usted la relación con su cultura estando aquí en los Estados Unidos? Bueno, la mantengo por tradición, es la comida típica.
Are you closely tied to your parents' culture?
I spend most of my time with my mom, so I have like a really good connection with her, like with the Salvadorian culture, especially with the food, because I love food.
Are you considered closely tied to your parents' culture?
I think, yeah, I mean, the reason why I would say that I am closely tied to being of like Hispanic heritage is because I was like raised in that style of life back in Mexico for the first 7 years of my life, like I said. And also, even when we moved here, like in my household, when it was like out of school time, we would only speak Spanish. My mother actually doesn't speak much English, and she doesn't like it when we speak English because she thinks we're making fun of her, or why not. So it's not that I mean, I don't know why she hasn't learned any English, but like the fact that at home you are not necessarily forced to, because I enjoy speaking Spanish, I love it, but at home I always understood and knew that it was Spanish only, and whereas in school it was mainly English or like a Spanglish sort of mix. At home it wasn't that, and I think that like the essence of speaking that language, the type of food that we ate, my mom would always cook home. Like sometimes she would make handmade tortillas, or like just different things like household remedies. For instance, we wouldn't necessarily go to a doctor. She would like make us tea, or like just simply like do things to cure us the old-fashioned way, I would say. Like, it's little things that make you feel like, oh, you are part of that Hispanic or Latino culture, where she teaches you these values, or like, oh, you have to love your family. You like when there's parties, it's huge parties. It's that idea that I think it still continues to be part of me, even though, yeah, I'm here now, this is a different setting, but when I go back home, it's always there, it's gonna be there, and I love it.
Yes and no. I feel like after coming to the United States, my ties to my culture have diminished to a certain extent. I do still maintain some of those ties, but I feel that because I live here, I have adopted some of the American cultural ideals, I guess, but I feel like I still have a strong connection to my parents.
How close are you to your culture?
I don't think I'm that close, simply because my grandparents came here and then my parents came here, so I wouldn't really consider I'm not first like generation. So I think there's like, as generations go, like you kind of get separated. So I don't think I'm that close with my culture. I mean, I speak Spanish, but it's still kind of like a challenge. I would say like English is my first language.
So you live in a predominant Mexican community. How does it feel when people automatically assume you're Mexican?
Well, I kind of feel outside because it is so Mexican here in Pomona, and for the reason that my parents are so Americanized, like I don't fit in with all the culture and stuff because I have no idea. I never grew up with that type of culture when I was young. I grew up as an American normal kid.
Well, to be honest, it's kind of like weird and kind of stupid that you just assume that I'm Mexican just because like the color of my skin really. I'm dark, but still. It's kind of weird because they don't know, they're not really open-minded about other countries that there are, like Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the rest of South America, you know. They don't say anything about that. I'm just like, really, out of all the things, Mexican? Well, I kind of would like to consider myself more Salvadorian, to be more outside the crowd, because being Mexican, to be honest, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of overrated. I want to be Salvadorian. Different cultures, different tastes. Another experience for people to know about.
I mean, I've actually never been just assumed Mexican, or not even Puerto Rican. A lot of people think like Brazilian or from another Latin American country. It makes me, but what pisses me off, because it's assumed rather than questioned.
How do you feel when people automatically assume you're Mexican?
I think that has been the case sometimes. Like, it doesn't usually, like, oh well, they won't tell you to your face, but I think people do assume that, oh well, you're Mexican just because you speak Spanish or simply because you look Hispanic. And me being Mexican, I don't mind it, but I know for a fact that people that aren't Mexican, that may be perceived as Mexican or are called Mexican, even though they may be Salvadorians or like Ecuadorians or Colombians, they might feel more offended. Whereas me, I don't necessarily feel offended. I just feel like people can be a little naive.
Well, the thing is that I am Mexican, so I can't really complain. But I do see why other people that are not Mexican would be frustrated or angry even, because I mean, I don't like people to assume I am something, so if they assume I'm Mexican, they also assume other stereotypes that come with being Mexican, like, oh, I must have been an illegal immigrant, or I'm in gangs or something like that. So when people say that I'm Mexican just by looking at me, I feel proud, but also I feel that they judge me in other ways that are not necessarily positive. So.
Es cierto eso, la mayoría en lo que sería el este de Los Ángeles o la ciudad de Los Ángeles, la mayoría es de origen mexicano, y cuando nos miran que hablamos el español, pues muchos nunca nos toman en cuenta en que somos centroamericanos.
Considering that you're half Mexican, half Salvadorian, are there any tensions that arise because of that?
Well, mostly like disciplinary and like family-wise, because I know more of my mom's side because they're all here except for one tia. And then with my dad's side, I only know one uncle because the rest of them are in Mexico. And well, towards disciplinary, it would be like my father's more lenient towards things because that's how he was raised, because he has like the older brother view, so he knows like what the young one is feeling. But with my mom, it's more strict because of how she lived, and it was like all work, study, work, same patterns. I think that's the way she wants me to do too, just work and study.
Like when I'm hanging out with like my dad's side of the family, my dad's Puerto Rican, they always brag on Mexicans, and I'm also half Mexican, so it puts me into that weird tension and like in the room, because like I've said like, hey, you know me, so I'm Mexican, and it's like, haha, let's poke fun at you. So there's tension. Like whenever I go to like one of my parents' siblings' houses, and like whenever I go to like my mom's side, like my grandma, she'll make fun of Puerto Ricans and how they're lazy and they talk too much, or so there's always like that tension. But I mean, outside the family, I guess I don't really pay attention to it as much because I don't necessarily care for what people have to say.
Muchas personas me han dicho de que ya perdí mi tono de voz de ser salvadoreña, la mexicana porque he convivido más con mexicanos acá, ¿no?
¿Y usted cree que su identificación es relacionado a su tono de voz o las palabras que usa o el lenguaje?
O sea, una parte puede ser el tono de voz y otra es el lenguaje, ¿no? Porque está combinado los salvadoreños con los mexicanos.
El destino quiso de que yo viviese aquí, lo cual estoy bien agradecido. Los Estados Unidos nos abre las puertas, a nuestros hijos crecen aquí y nos vamos quedando.